The grand ballroom of Ashford Manor glittered with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off crystal chandeliers and silk gowns. Among the servants rushing to fulfill every aristocratic whim, one young maid limped desperately through the servants' corridor, her ankle throbbing with each agonizing step. Eleanor Hartley had hidden her injury for hours, terrified of losing her position. But as she stumbled near the Duke's private box, clutching the wall for support, she whispered words that would change her fate forever. "Your Grace, forgive me. Can I rest here?" What happened next would scandalize London society and prove that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with a moment of vulnerability. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. Eleanor Hartley had always known her place in the world, and it was decidedly below stairs. At 22 years old, she possessed a quiet beauty that her plain servant's dress could not entirely conceal. Chestnut hair always pinned severely back, hazel eyes that observed everything, and delicate features that spoke of gentler origins. But beauty meant nothing when one's family had fallen from minor gentry to abject poverty after her father's failed investments. Now she was a housemaid at Ashford Manor, one of dozens serving the illustrious Thornbury family during the height of the London season of 1887. The manor itself was a testament to old money and older power. Situated in Mayfair, it boasted 4 stories of pristine Georgian architecture, with marble floors that Eleanor scrubbed until her knees ached, and windows so numerous she sometimes lost count while polishing them. The Thornbury family had held their dukedom for 3 centuries, their influence extending into Parliament, banking, and the very fabric of British society. To work here was considered fortunate for someone of Eleanor's reduced circumstances, even if the housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwood, reminded her daily that she should be grateful for every crust of bread. Eleanor's days began at 5 in the morning and rarely ended before midnight, especially during the season when the family hosted elaborate balls and dinners. She carried coal, emptied chamber pots, pressed linens, and made herself invisible whenever the family or their guests passed by. The rules were absolute: never speak unless spoken to, never make eye contact with your betters, and never ever presume yourself worthy of notice. Yet Eleanor harbored a secret dream, one she barely admitted even to herself, in the darkness of the cramped attic room she shared with 3 other maids. She had once believed in love, in the romantic notion that a good heart mattered more than a title. Her mother, before dying of consumption 2 years prior, had told her stories of her own courtship, how Eleanor's father had been charming and passionate, how love had seemed enough. Of course, those stories always ended with a reminder of how passion faded and practical matters crushed romantic ideals. Still, Eleanor couldn't quite extinguish the small flame of hope that somewhere, somehow, genuine affection might find her. The current excitement at Ashford Manor centered on the Duke himself, Sebastian Thornbury, the 6th Duke of Ashford, who had recently returned from 3 years abroad, managing family estates in India. At 30 years old, he was considered one of London's most eligible bachelors, though rumours suggested he found society tedious and preferred the company of books to ballrooms. Eleanor had glimpsed him only twice since his return, once in the hallway when she'd pressed herself against the wall as he passed, and once through a doorway when he'd been reading in the library, his dark hair falling across his forehead as he frowned at some dense philosophical tome. From the servants' gossip, Eleanor learned that the Duke was under tremendous pressure from his mother, the Dowager Duchess, to marry appropriately. The leading candidate was Lady Victoria Ashford-Kent, a distant cousin whose family's wealth matched the Thornburys' prestige. Lady Victoria was celebrated for her golden beauty, her impeccable manners, and her complete lack of original thought, though this last quality was considered an asset in aristocratic circles. The servants whispered that an announcement was expected any day. Eleanor tried not to think about such things as she went about her duties. What did ducal marriages matter to someone who would spend her life carrying water and beating carpets? Yet she couldn't help noticing things others missed. She noticed that the Duke always thanked servants by name when they attended him, an almost unheard-of courtesy. She noticed the books he read, philosophy, social reform, accounts of life in other countries, were not the typical aristocratic fare. And she noticed that when Lady Victoria visited, his expression grew carefully neutral, as though he were performing a role in a play he hadn't chosen. The grand ball, scheduled for the 23rd of May, was to be the social event of the season. The Dowager Duchess had spared no expense, determined to showcase her son to society, and many suspected to create the perfect setting for a proposal to Lady Victoria. For weeks, the household had been in controlled chaos. Every surface gleamed, every flower arrangement was perfection itself, and the servants were drilled repeatedly on their duties until they could perform them in their sleep. Eleanor's assignment for the evening was to attend to the ladies' retiring room, helping guests with torn hems, spilled wine, and various other minor emergencies that arose during such events. It was considered a prestigious position for a housemaid, one that Mrs. Blackwood had assigned her with obvious reluctance, noting that Eleanor at least had the manners of her former station and wouldn't embarrass the household. The morning of the ball, Eleanor woke with an inexplicable sense of anticipation. Foolish, she told herself as she dressed in the darkness, careful not to wake her roommates. Nothing about this day would be different from any other, except that she would work even harder and sleep even less. Yet the feeling persisted as she descended the narrow servant stairs to begin her duties. By afternoon, the household hummed with barely contained energy. The ballroom had been transformed into a glittering fantasy of white roses and candlelight. The musicians were rehearsing in the gallery. The kitchens produced an endless stream of delicacies. And Eleanor, having been sent on a dozen urgent errands, found her feet aching in her worn boots. She should have mentioned the pain earlier, but she'd learned that complaints led to dismissal. So she continued, ignoring the growing throb in her left ankle, which she'd twisted slightly that morning while carrying a heavy bucket up from the scullery. By the time the first guests arrived at 8 o'clock, Eleanor was biting her lip with each step. But she maintained her composure, her face a mask of serene efficiency. The ball began with all the splendor the Dowager Duchess had envisioned. Ladies in jewel-toned silks swirled across the floor with gentlemen in impeccable evening dress. The Duke, devastatingly handsome in black and white, opened the dancing with Lady Victoria, whose diamond tiara caught the light with each graceful turn. Eleanor, stationed near the ladies' retiring room, watched through a doorway and felt the vast distance between her world and theirs. As the evening progressed, her ankle worsened. What had been a dull ache became sharp pain, and she realized with growing alarm that something was genuinely wrong. But she couldn't abandon her post, not during the most important ball of the season. So she continued, her movements becoming slower, more careful, until finally, during a brief lull, she knew she had to find somewhere to sit, just for a moment, before she collapsed entirely. Eleanor's vision blurred at the edges as she limped away from her post, desperate for somewhere, anywhere, to rest her injured ankle before it gave out completely. The servants' quarters were too far. She'd never make it down those stairs without falling. The retiring room was full of ladies and their maids. In her desperation, she remembered the Duke's private box, a small balcony overlooking the ballroom that he rarely used during balls, preferring to circulate among his guests. She shouldn't. She knew she shouldn't. But the pain had become unbearable, shooting up her leg with each step, and she could feel her ankle swelling inside her boot. Just 5 minutes, she told herself, just long enough to sit down and catch her breath, and no one would ever know. The corridor leading to the Duke's box was mercifully empty, lit by a single gas lamp. Eleanor grasped the wall for support, her breath coming in short gasps, and pushed open the door. The small space was dark, except for the light filtering in from the ballroom below, where the orchestra played a waltz and hundreds of candles created a scene of impossible beauty. She had just lowered herself onto one of the velvet chairs, relief flooding through her as the weight came off her injured ankle, when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Panic seized her. If she were discovered here, in the Duke's private space, she would be dismissed immediately without a character reference. She tried to stand, to hide, but her ankle buckled beneath her, and she gasped in pain. The door opened, and Eleanor found herself looking up into the face of Sebastian Thornbury, Duke of Ashford. For a moment, neither spoke. The Duke's dark eyes took in the scene. A housemaid in his private box, clearly in distress, her face pale with pain and fear. Eleanor's mind raced through explanations, apologies, pleas for mercy, but what came out was a whisper born of pure desperation. "Your Grace, forgive me. Can I rest here?" She expected anger, dismissal, contempt. What she didn't expect was for the Duke to immediately kneel beside her chair, his expression transformed from surprise to concern. "You're hurt," he said, and his voice was nothing like the aristocratic drawl she'd heard him use in company. It was direct, warm, genuinely worried. "Your ankle?" Eleanor could only nod, mortified beyond words. The Duke of Ashford was kneeling before her, a housemaid, examining her injury with careful hands. "It's quite swollen," he said after a moment. "You should not be walking on this. How long have you been in pain?" "Since this morning, Your Grace," Eleanor managed. "I twisted it, but I couldn't. I had my duties." Something flickered across his face, anger, but not at her. "Your duties," he repeated quietly. "Of course." He stood abruptly, and Eleanor braced herself for the dismissal she knew must come. Instead, he said, "Can you stand if I support you?" "Your Grace, please. I'll go back to work. I just needed a moment." "You'll do nothing of the sort," he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "You can barely walk. I'm taking you to the physician." Before Eleanor could process this absurd statement, the Duke had bent and, with shocking gentleness, lifted her into his arms. She was too stunned to protest as he carried her out of the box and down the corridor, not toward the servants' quarters, but toward the main staircase. "Your Grace, no!" Eleanor finally found her voice. "Please, you can't. People will see." "Let them," he said simply, and there was something in his voice that silenced her protests. They descended the grand staircase just as the waltz ended. The sudden silence made their appearance all the more dramatic. Every head turned, every conversation stopped. The Duke of Ashford, the most eligible bachelor in London, was carrying a housemaid in his arms, treating her with a tenderness reserved for ladies of quality. Eleanor heard the gasps, the whispers that started like wind through leaves. She saw the Dowager Duchess's face go white with shock, then red with fury. She saw Lady Victoria's perfect features twist with disbelief and something uglier, contempt. And she saw the dozens of aristocratic faces registering scandal, delight at gossip, and judgment. "Sebastian!" The Dowager Duchess's voice cut through the murmurs. "What is the meaning of this?" The Duke didn't pause in his progress across the ballroom floor, though he did address his mother. "This young woman is injured and requires medical attention. I'm taking her to Dr. Morrison." "She's a servant!" Lady Victoria's voice rang out shrill with indignation. "Have one of the other servants deal with it. You're making a spectacle of yourself." The Duke stopped then and turned to face Lady Victoria. Eleanor, still in his arms, wanted to disappear, to die, to be anywhere but the center of this nightmare. "This young woman," the Duke said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "has been working despite an injury that should have been tended hours ago. She has been in pain all evening, while ensuring that you and every other guest here lacked for nothing. That she felt she couldn't ask for help, that she had to hide her suffering for fear of losing her position, speaks to a failure of compassion that I find deeply troubling." The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Victoria's face flushed an ugly red. "You're defending a servant. Have you lost your senses? She's probably faking to gain your attention." "That's enough." The Duke's voice was quiet, but carried an unmistakable authority. Eleanor has shown more courage and dedication tonight than most people demonstrate in a lifetime. I'll thank you not to insult her further." He knew her name. Through her shock and humiliation, Eleanor registered that impossible fact. The Duke knew her name. "This is absurd." Lady Victoria's voice rose to a near shriek. "I won't stand here and be humiliated while you fawn over some scheming maid. If you think for one moment that I would ever—" "I think," the Duke interrupted, "that we have both been saved from a terrible mistake. I wish you well, Lady Victoria, but I believe our understanding, such as it was, is at an end." The ballroom erupted in whispers. The Dowager Duchess looked as though she might faint. Lady Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly before she turned and fled, her mother hurrying after her. And Eleanor, still cradled in the Duke's arms, felt her world tilt on its axis. "Your Grace," she whispered, "what have you done?" He looked down at her, and for the first time that evening he smiled. "Something I should have done long ago," he said. "I've stopped pretending." He carried her out of the ballroom, leaving behind a scandal that would be discussed in drawing rooms across London for months to come. Eleanor's mind reeled with the implications. She'd be dismissed, certainly. The Duke would face social censure. His mother would never forgive him. And all because she'd been foolish enough to ask if she could rest. Dr. Morrison, the family physician who'd been attending the ball, was summoned to a private sitting room. He examined Eleanor's ankle with professional efficiency while the Duke stood nearby, refusing to leave despite the impropriety. The diagnosis was a severe sprain, requiring rest and elevation for at least a week. "She cannot return to her duties," Dr. Morrison said firmly. "She needs complete rest, or she risks permanent damage." "She'll have it," the Duke said. "See that she's given one of the guest rooms and whatever care she requires." "Your Grace, no," Eleanor protested weakly. "I can't possibly—" "You can and you will," he said. "This is not a request, Miss Hartley. It's an order." After Dr. Morrison left, Eleanor found herself alone with the Duke. Her bandaged ankle elevated on cushions, her mind still struggling to comprehend what had happened. "Your Grace," she began, "I'm so sorry. I've ruined everything." "You've ruined nothing," he interrupted gently. He pulled a chair close to where she lay on the settee. "If anything, you've given me an excuse to escape a fate I've been dreading for months. Lady Victoria was never going to be my wife," he said firmly. "My mother arranged that understanding without consulting me. I've been trying to find a graceful way to end it without causing a scandal. It seems I've failed at the graceful part." Eleanor stared at him, this man who was supposed to be far above her, unreachable as the stars. "But why? Why would you risk so much for someone like me?" He was quiet for a moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Do you know what I noticed about you, Miss Hartley? You were kind to the scullery maid who spilled tea on the hallway carpet last week. You didn't scold her or report her. You helped her clean it up and told her everyone makes mistakes. I was in the library, and I saw the whole thing through the doorway." Eleanor had no memory of being observed during that small moment of compassion. "She was frightened," she said simply. "She's only 14, and Mrs. Blackwood is harsh." "Exactly," the Duke said softly. "You saw a frightened child, not a clumsy servant. Do you know how rare that is, how rare you are?" Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm nobody, Your Grace. A housemaid with no prospects and a ruined reputation after tonight." "You're wrong on both counts," he said. "But we can discuss that later. For now, you need to rest. Tomorrow, when you're feeling better, I'd like to speak with you about your future, if you'll permit me." He stood to leave, and Eleanor felt a sudden panic at the thought of him going. "Your Grace, thank you for your kindness. I'll never forget it." He paused at the door and looked back at her, something unreadable in his dark eyes. "The kindness, Miss Hartley, has been entirely yours. Sleep well." After he left, Eleanor lay in the elegant guest room, her mind whirling. Outside, she could hear the ball continuing, though she imagined the gossip had replaced the music as the evening's primary entertainment. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in years, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through silk curtains and a moment of complete disorientation. The bed beneath her was soft beyond imagining, the linen smooth and scented with lavender. For a confused moment, she thought she was dreaming, but the dull throb in her ankle reminded her that the previous night had been all too real. A soft knock at the door was followed by the entrance of a maid Eleanor didn't recognize. Clearly a lady's maid, not a housemaid like herself. "Good morning, miss," the woman said, with a respectful curtsy that made Eleanor want to laugh hysterically. "His Grace asked me to attend you. I'm Miss Peters. I've brought breakfast and fresh clothes." "I don't understand," Eleanor said weakly. "Where is Mrs. Blackwood? I should be at my duties." "Mrs. Blackwood has been informed that you're under His Grace's protection and are not to be disturbed," Miss Peters said calmly, setting down a tray laden with more food than Eleanor usually saw in a week. "You're to rest and recover. His Grace will call on you this afternoon if you're feeling well enough to receive him." The formality of it all was absurd. Eleanor was a housemaid, not a lady receiving callers. Yet Miss Peters treated her with perfect courtesy as she helped her wash and dress in a simple but well-made day dress that fit surprisingly well. "His Grace had this sent from the modiste this morning," Miss Peters explained. "He estimated your size. I hope it's comfortable." Eleanor touched the soft fabric, overwhelmed. The Duke had thought of her comfort, had sent for proper clothes, had assigned her a lady's maid. It was too much, too impossible. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. Miss Peters smiled gently. "His Grace seems to think otherwise, miss, and if I may say so, I've served this family for 15 years, and I've never seen him so determined about anything." After Miss Peters left, Eleanor ate breakfast. Actual eggs and toast and jam, not the thin porridge servants received, and tried to make sense of her situation. She was ruined, certainly. No respectable household would hire her after last night's scandal. But the Duke had said something about discussing her future. What could he possibly mean? The answer came that afternoon when Sebastian Thornbury was announced. Eleanor struggled to stand, but he waved her back to her seat. "Please, don't injure yourself further on my account. How is your ankle?" "Much better, Your Grace. Dr. Morrison's treatment was very effective." Eleanor twisted her hands in her lap, acutely aware of how improper this situation was. "Your Grace, I must know. Am I to be dismissed?" He looked genuinely surprised. "Dismissed? Good God, no. Why would you think that? Because I've caused a terrible scandal. Because I was found in your private box. Because I chose to carry you through a ballroom full of society's most judgmental members." He smiled slightly. "Miss Hartley, if anyone is to be blamed for last night's events, it's me. You were injured and in pain. I responded as any decent human being should. That it shocked people says more about society's failings than yours or mine." Eleanor stared at him. "Your mother must be furious." My mother," he said carefully, "is adjusting to the reality that I will not be managed like one of the estates. We had a long conversation this morning. She's not pleased, but she understands that I will make my own choices." He pulled his chair closer, his expression growing serious. "Miss Hartley, Eleanor, if I may, I want to propose something unusual. I have an aunt, my father's sister, who lives in Bath. Lady Agatha Thornbury is a formidable woman who has never cared a fig for society's opinions. She runs a literary salon and has been after me for years to send her someone intelligent to help manage her correspondence and social calendar. The position would be more companion than servant, and it would remove you from London until the scandal dies down." Eleanor's heart sank. He was sending her away. Of course he was. What had she expected? "I understand, Your Grace. When should I leave?" "You misunderstand," he said gently. "This isn't a dismissal, it's an opportunity. Aunt Agatha will pay you well, treat you with respect, and introduce you to a world of ideas and conversation that you'll find stimulating. She's also one of the few people whose opinion I truly value. I've written to her about you, and she's eager to meet you." You wrote to her about me? Eleanor couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice. I did. I told her you were intelligent, kind, and deserving of better circumstances than fate had provided. She wrote back immediately, offering you the position. He paused, studying her face. But only if you want it. I won't force you into anything. If you prefer, I can arrange a position elsewhere, or provide you with funds to— Why? Eleanor interrupted, the question bursting out of her. Why are you doing this? I'm nobody. You don't owe me anything. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and sincere. Do you remember, about a month ago when you found me in the library late at night? I'd fallen asleep over my books, and you woke me gently and reminded me that I'd be more comfortable in my own bed. Eleanor did remember. She'd been terrified of disturbing him, but more worried that he'd wake with a stiff neck. Yes, Your Grace, you didn't treat me like a duke that night. You treated me like a human being who'd foolishly fallen asleep in an uncomfortable chair. You smiled at me, a real smile, not the careful, blank expression servants usually wear, and you said, "Even dukes need proper rest, sir." Do you know how long it had been since anyone had shown me simple, uncomplicated kindness? Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. I didn't think you'd remember that. I remember everything about you, he said quietly, and something in his tone made her breath catch. I remember how you arrange the flowers in the morning room, always putting the most beautiful blooms where they'll catch the light. I remember how you hum while you work, when you think no one can hear. I remember the day you cried in the servants' hall because one of the kitchen cats died, and how you gave it a proper burial in the garden. You saw that? Eleanor whispered, mortified. I see you, Eleanor, he said simply. I have for months. And what I see is someone extraordinary, trapped in circumstances that don't reflect her worth. So yes, I'm offering you this position with my aunt, but I'm also offering you something else. Time. Time away from here. Time to heal and grow and discover what you want from life. And time for me to prove that last night wasn't an impulsive gesture. It was the beginning of something I hope you'll allow me to pursue. Eleanor's mind reeled. Was he suggesting what she thought he was suggesting? Your Grace, I don't understand. I'm suggesting, he said, his dark eyes holding hers, that you go to Bath, meet my aunt, and see what life can offer you beyond these walls. And I'm suggesting that I will visit Bath frequently as I always do, and that we might get to know each other properly, as equals, not as duke and servant. We can never be equals, Eleanor said, though her heart was pounding. Can't we? He smiled. My aunt would disagree. She believes that intelligence and character are the only true measures of worth. She'll like you immensely, I think. And perhaps in time, you'll come to see yourself as I see you, as someone remarkable. Eleanor didn't know what to say. Everything he was offering seemed impossible, a dream that would shatter if she examined it too closely. Yet the sincerity in his eyes was undeniable. If I go to Bath, she said slowly, what happens to us, to whatever this is? That, Sebastian said softly, will be entirely up to you. I won't pressure you or rush you. I simply want the chance to know you better, and for you to know me, not as a duke, but as Sebastian. Can you give me that chance? Eleanor thought of her life before this moment, the endless drudgery, the invisibility, the certainty that nothing would ever change. And she thought of the man before her who had seen her when no one else had, who had risked scandal to help her, who was offering her a future she'd never dared imagine. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll go to Bath. I'll meet your aunt, and I'll give you that chance. His smile was like sunrise. Thank you, Eleanor. You won't regret this, I promise. 3 days later, Eleanor found herself in a comfortable carriage heading west toward Bath, her ankle nearly healed and her mind full of wonder. The Duke had arranged everything, her transportation, her wardrobe, even a small purse of money for personal expenses. Miss Peters had helped her pack, treating her like a lady rather than a servant, and several of the other maids had whispered their envy and good wishes. Mrs. Blackwood had been conspicuously absent, but Eleanor had heard through the household gossip that the housekeeper had been severely reprimanded by the Duke for creating an environment where servants felt they couldn't report injuries. It was a small justice, but it warmed Eleanor's heart nonetheless. As the carriage rolled through the English countryside, Eleanor watched the landscape change from London's smoke and crowds to green hills and stone villages. She was travelling toward an unknown future, leaving behind everything familiar. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a growing excitement, a sense that her life was finally beginning. Bath, when they arrived, was beautiful. A city of honey-coloured stone and elegant crescents, with the River Avon winding through its heart. Lady Agatha's townhouse was in the Royal Crescent, a stunning curved row of Georgian houses overlooking parkland. Eleanor had barely stepped from the carriage when the front door flew open and a tall, striking woman in her 60s emerged. "You must be Eleanor!" Lady Agatha's voice was warm and commanding. "Come in, come in! You must be exhausted from the journey. Don't stand on ceremony with me, my dear. I'm far too old for formality, and Sebastian tells me you're far too intelligent to waste time on it." Within minutes, Eleanor found herself seated in a comfortable drawing room, drinking tea and being thoroughly examined by Lady Agatha's sharp blue eyes. "So," the older woman said, "you're the girl who's turned my nephew's world upside down. Good. It was time someone did. My lady, I didn't mean to—" "Of course you didn't. The best things never happen on purpose." Lady Agatha set down her teacup. "Sebastian wrote me everything. About your injury, about that dreadful scene at the ball, about how you've been treated. He also told me you're well read despite your limited education, that you have a natural grace, and that you're kind to people who can do nothing for you. Those are the qualities I value. Can you write a decent letter?" "Yes, my lady." "Can you tolerate poets?" "I host several, and they can be tiresome." Eleanor couldn't help smiling. "I believe so, my lady." "Excellent. Then we'll get along splendidly. Your duties will be light, helping me with correspondence, organizing my salon evenings, occasionally reading to me when my eyes tire. In return, you'll have your own room, proper wages, and access to my library, which is extensive. You'll also attend my salons, not as a servant but as a participant. I expect you to have opinions and express them. Can you do that?" Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "My lady, why are you being so kind to me?" Lady Agatha's expression softened. "Because Sebastian asked me to, and I've never known him to care about anyone the way he clearly cares about you. Also, because I was once in a position not unlike yours, dependent on the charity of others, uncertain of my future. Someone gave me a chance, and I've never forgotten it. Now dry your eyes and let me show you to your room. Tomorrow, we'll begin your education in earnest. If my nephew is going to court you properly, you'll need to be prepared for the battle ahead." "Battle, my lady?" Lady Agatha smiled grimly. "My dear girl, when a duke decides to marry outside his class, it's war. But don't worry, I've been winning wars since before you were born. By the time I'm finished with you, society won't know what hit them." That night, Eleanor lay in her comfortable bed in her own room, a room with a writing desk and a window overlooking the crescent, and allowed herself to believe just for a moment that happiness might actually be possible. Somewhere in London, Sebastian was thinking of her, and here in Bath she had found an unexpected ally and friend. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, it was also full of promise. 3 months in Bath transformed Eleanor in ways she could never have imagined. Under Lady Agatha's guidance, she read voraciously philosophy, poetry, political theory, novels both respectable and scandalous. She attended salon evenings where writers, artists, and intellectuals gathered to debate ideas, and she discovered that her opinions, once voiced, were valued and respected. Lady Agatha introduced her not as a companion, but as "my dear friend, Miss Hartley," and gradually, Eleanor began to believe it might be true. Sebastian visited Bath every fortnight, always staying at his club to preserve propriety, but spending his days with Eleanor and his aunt. They walked along the royal crescent, visited the Roman baths, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. Eleanor learned that Sebastian had spent his years in India not merely managing estates, but working to improve conditions for the workers, that he'd been appalled by the injustices he'd witnessed, and that he'd returned to England determined to use his position for meaningful reform. "I've been thinking about my seat in Parliament," he told her one afternoon, as they strolled through Sydney Gardens. "I've neglected it shamefully, but I want to change that. There are bills being proposed about working conditions, about education for the poor. I want to be part of that conversation." Eleanor smiled at his passion. "You'll make enemies among your own class." "I expect so," he said cheerfully, "but I'll have allies too. And I'll have you, if you'll continue to tolerate my company." Their relationship deepened with each visit, moving from careful courtesy to genuine friendship, to something neither of them named but both felt growing between them. Sebastian never pressed her, never demanded more than she was willing to give, but his feelings were clear in every look, every gentle touch of her hand, every smile that lit his face when he saw her. Lady Agatha watched it all with satisfaction. "He's courting you properly," she told Eleanor one evening. "Taking his time, letting you find your footing, that's how it should be. Though I warn you, my dear, society won't make this easy. When you return to London, and you will return, you'll face opposition that will make that ballroom scene look like a garden party." "Perhaps we shouldn't return," Eleanor said quietly. "Perhaps it's better if we stay here, where people don't know." "Nonsense," Lady Agatha interrupted briskly. "Hiding achieves nothing. Besides, you're not the same girl who arrived here 3 months ago. You've found your voice and your confidence. You're ready to face them." The test came sooner than expected. In late August, Lady Agatha received an invitation to a grand charity ball in London, hosted by the Duchess of Pemberton to benefit hospitals for the poor. "We're going," Lady Agatha announced. "All 3 of us. It's time to show society that you're not some scandalous secret to be hidden away." Eleanor's stomach churned with anxiety, but Sebastian, who had arrived for his weekly visit, took her hands in his. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," he said gently. "But I think you are. I think you're stronger than you know." "I'm terrified," Eleanor admitted. "So am I," he said, surprising her. "But we'll face them together. And Eleanor, I want you to know that whatever happens at this ball, whatever society says or thinks, my feelings won't change. I love you. I've loved you since that night you asked if you could rest, maybe even before. I'm not asking you to say it back, not yet, not until you're certain, but I want you to know where I stand." Eleanor's breath caught. He loved her. This man, this duke, this impossible, wonderful man loved her. "Sebastian," she whispered, using his given name for the first time. "I don't," he said softly. "Not yet. Wait until after the ball. Wait until you've seen what facing society together means. Then if you still want me, tell me, but only then." The journey to London felt both too long and too short. Eleanor wore a gown Lady Agatha had commissioned, a stunning creation in deep blue silk that made her eyes luminous and her figure elegant. Her hair was dressed by Lady Agatha's own maid, swept up in a style that was both fashionable and flattering. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. "You look like a duchess," Lady Agatha said with satisfaction. "Now you must act like one. Head high, shoulders back, and remember, you have nothing to be ashamed of." The Duchess of Pemberton's ballroom was even grander than the Thornburys, glittering with crystal and candlelight, filled with the cream of London society. Eleanor felt every eye turned toward them as they were announced: Lady Agatha Thornbury, Miss Eleanor Hartley, and His Grace, the Duke of Ashford. The whispers started immediately, a susurrus of shock and speculation. Eleanor saw familiar faces from that terrible night 3 months ago. Lady Victoria, looking brittle and furious, surrounded by sympathetic friends. The Dowager Duchess, whose expression was carefully neutral but whose eyes were cold. And dozens of others who had witnessed her humiliation. Sebastian offered Eleanor his arm, and together they descended the stairs into the ballroom. Lady Agatha swept ahead of them, immediately engaging the Duchess of Pemberton in conversation, her commanding presence drawing attention and providing cover. "Breathe," Sebastian murmured. "You're doing wonderfully." They had barely reached the ballroom floor when Lady Victoria appeared, her face flushed with champagne and malice. "Well," she said loudly enough to be heard by those nearby, "if it isn't the scheming maid and her besotted duke. Tell me, Miss Hartley, how does it feel to have trapped a man so far above your station? Did you practice your limp, or was that genuine?" Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, but before she could respond, Sebastian stepped forward, his voice cold with fury. "Lady Victoria, you will apologize to Miss Hartley immediately, or I will ensure that every person in this room knows exactly why our engagement ended, and it had nothing to do with Eleanor and everything to do with your treatment of servants, your casual cruelty, and your complete lack of compassion." Lady Victoria's eyes widened. "You wouldn't dare—" "Try me," Sebastian said quietly, and something in his tone made her step back. An older gentleman Eleanor didn't recognize approached, his expression thoughtful. "Ashford," he said, nodding to Sebastian, "I heard you're planning to take a more active role in Parliament. About time. We need voices willing to speak for reform." He turned to Eleanor. "Miss Hartley, Lady Agatha tells me you've been helping her organize her literary salon. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the education bills being proposed." Eleanor blinked, surprised to be addressed as an intellectual equal. Drawing on the months of reading and discussion with Lady Agatha, she offered her opinion that education should be available to all children regardless of class, that it was both a moral imperative and a practical necessity for the nation's future. The gentleman nodded approvingly. "Sensible views. Ashford, you found yourself an intelligent companion. Rare quality, that." He moved away, and Eleanor realized that others had been listening, their expressions ranging from surprised to approving. The evening progressed in a strange mixture of triumph and tension. Some guests snubbed them openly, turning away or whispering behind fans. But others, particularly those in Sebastian's political circle and Lady Agatha's intellectual friends, engaged them warmly. Eleanor found herself in conversations about literature, social reform, and current events, and discovered that she could hold her own. The turning point came when the Duchess of Pemberton herself approached. "Miss Hartley," she said, her tone neutral, "Lady Agatha speaks very highly of you. She tells me you've been instrumental in organizing her salon. I'm planning a similar venture to raise funds for hospital reform. Would you be willing to advise me?" Eleanor glanced at Sebastian, who nodded encouragingly. "I would be honored, Your Grace." The Duchess smiled slightly. "Excellent. Call on me next week and we'll discuss details." She turned to Sebastian. "Ashford, your aunt tells me you're serious about this young woman. I hope you know what you're doing." "I do, Your Grace," Sebastian said firmly. "More than I've ever known anything." The Duchess studied them both for a long moment, then nodded. "Then I wish you well. God knows society could use a bit of shaking up." She moved away, and Eleanor realized that they had just received a form of blessing from one of society's most influential figures. As the evening drew to a close, Sebastian led Eleanor onto the terrace for a moment of privacy. The London night was warm, the garden below fragrant with late summer roses. "You were magnificent tonight," he said softly. "Every person who spoke with you came away impressed. You've won them over." "Not all of them," Eleanor said, thinking of Lady Victoria's venomous expression. "The ones who matter," Sebastian corrected. He took her hands in his dark eyes serious in the moonlight. "Eleanor, I told you I wouldn't ask until after the ball. Well, the ball is ending, and I find I can't wait any longer. I love you. I want to marry you, to spend my life with you, to face whatever challenges come our way together. I know the obstacles. I know society will never fully accept us, that my mother will be difficult, that there will always be people who see you as beneath me. But I also know that you are the most extraordinary person I've ever met. and that I would rather face scandal with you than live a respectable life with anyone else. Will you marry me?" Eleanor looked at this man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had carried her through a ballroom full of judgment, who had given her time and space to become herself. She thought of the girl she had been 3 months ago, frightened, uncertain, convinced she deserved nothing, and she thought of the woman she had become, educated, confident, capable of standing in a ballroom and holding her own. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Yes, Sebastian, I'll marry you. I love you. I think I've loved you since that night when you knelt beside my chair and treated me like I mattered. You've given me so much, not just material things, but belief in myself. I want to spend my life with you, facing whatever comes together." Sebastian's smile was radiant. He reached into his pocket and drew out a ring, a simple but beautiful sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. "This was my grandmother's," he said as he slipped it onto her finger. "She was a remarkable woman who married my grandfather against his family's wishes. They were happy for 50 years. I hope we'll be just as fortunate." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, and Eleanor felt the last of her fears dissolve. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Inside the ballroom, Lady Agatha saw them through the terrace doors and smiled. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. But she had no doubt about the outcome. Eleanor had proven herself tonight, and Sebastian had proven his devotion. Society would adjust, as it always did eventually. The Dowager Duchess, watching from across the room, sighed heavily. Her son was lost to her careful plans, committed to a path she would never have chosen. But seeing his face as he looked at Eleanor, seeing a joy she'd never witnessed during his courtship of Lady Victoria, she felt something shift in her heart. Perhaps, she thought reluctantly, there were worse things than a son who married for love. Lady Victoria, watching from the shadows, felt only bitterness. But even she could see that the battle was lost. The Duke of Ashford had made his choice, and society, fickle as always, was beginning to accept it. As Sebastian and Eleanor returned to the ballroom hand in hand, the orchestra struck up a waltz. "May I have this dance, Miss Hartley?" Sebastian asked formally. "You may, Your Grace," Eleanor replied with a smile, "now and always." They swept onto the floor, and this time the whispers that followed them were tinged with admiration rather than scandal. The maid who had asked if she could rest had found her place in the world, and the Duke who had carried her had found his heart's desire. The announcement of the Duke of Ashford's engagement to Miss Eleanor Hartley appeared in the Times 3 days after the Pemberton ball. The reaction was predictably mixed, some scandalized, some intrigued, some genuinely pleased. Lady Agatha's drawing room was flooded with callers, some offering congratulations, others fishing for gossip. Eleanor handled them all with the grace she'd developed over the past months, neither apologizing for her origins nor pretending to be something she wasn't. The Dowager Duchess requested a private meeting with Eleanor, and it was with considerable trepidation that Eleanor presented herself at Ashford Manor. She was shown into the same drawing room, where months ago she had carried coal and dusted furniture. Now she sat on the silk sofa as a guest, waiting for the woman who would be her mother-in-law. The Dowager Duchess entered with her characteristic regal bearing, her expression unreadable. For a long moment she simply studied Eleanor, who resisted the urge to fidget under that penetrating gaze. "You're not what I would have chosen for my son," the Dowager Duchess said finally. "I won't pretend otherwise. I had hoped for a connection that would strengthen our family's position, a bride who understood from birth the responsibilities of her station." Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "I understand, Your Grace. I can't change my birth, but I can promise you that I will do everything in my power to be worthy of Sebastian's faith in me and to honor the position I'll hold as his wife." The Dowager Duchess's expression softened slightly. "You have courage. I'll grant you that. And my sister-in-law speaks very highly of you, which carries considerable weight. Agatha is an excellent judge of character. She paused, then continued more gently. "I've watched my son these past months. He's happier than I've seen him in years. He's engaged with his work in Parliament. He's standing up for his beliefs, and he smiles." "That's your doing, Miss Hartley. He's done as much for me, Your Grace," Eleanor said softly. "I know. I've made inquiries about your time in my household. I learned that you were an exemplary worker, that you were kind to the other servants, that you never complained despite being given some of the hardest tasks." Odile, the Dowager Duchess's voice took on a note of regret. "I also learned that my housekeeper created an environment where you felt you couldn't report an injury for fear of dismissal. That is unacceptable, and I've taken steps to ensure it never happens again." Eleanor was surprised by this admission. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Don't thank me. It's simply what should have been done long ago." The Dowager Duchess stood, and Eleanor rose as well. "I won't pretend this will be easy. There will be people who never accept you, who will always see you as the housemaid who trapped a duke. But there will also be those who admire your intelligence and your character. Focus on the latter and ignore the former. And know that while I may not have chosen you, I will support my son's choice. You'll have my public backing, even if my private reservations take time to overcome." It was more than Eleanor had hoped for. "Your Grace, I'm grateful for your honesty and your support. I know I have much to learn, but I promise you I will learn it." The Dowager Duchess nodded. "Agatha will help you. She's been navigating society's treacherous waters for decades. Listen to her, and you'll do well." She hesitated, then added, "And call me Catherine. If you're to be my daughter-in-law, we should at least attempt familiarity." Eleanor left Ashford Manor feeling as though a great weight had been lifted. She would never have a warm relationship with Sebastian's mother, but they had reached an understanding, and that was enough. The wedding preparations consumed the following weeks. Eleanor insisted on a relatively small ceremony. She had no desire for a grand society spectacle, but even small by ducal standards meant 200 guests and a reception at Ashford Manor. Lady Agatha took charge of the details with military precision, ensuring that everything was perfect while also shielding Eleanor from the more overwhelming aspects of planning. Eleanor's wedding gown was a masterpiece of ivory silk and delicate lace, elegant in its simplicity. As she dressed on her wedding morning, attended by Lady Agatha and Miss Peters, she thought of how far she had come from the frightened housemaid who had asked if she could rest. "You look beautiful," Lady Agatha said, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Sebastian won't be able to take his eyes off you." "I'm terrified," Eleanor admitted. "What if I make a mistake? What if I use the wrong fork or say something inappropriate?" Lady Agatha laughed. "My dear girl, you've held your own in drawing rooms full of intellectuals and politicians. You can certainly manage a wedding breakfast. Besides, Sebastian loves you for who you are, not for your ability to navigate arbitrary social rules. Remember that, and you'll be fine." The ceremony took place at St. George's, Hanover Square, the fashionable church where generations of aristocrats had married. As Eleanor walked down the aisle on Lady Agatha's arm, she had no father to give her away, and Lady Agatha had insisted on the honour. She saw Sebastian waiting at the altar, his face transformed by joy. The vows were traditional, but when Sebastian spoke them, his voice was filled with such emotion that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. When it was her turn, she looked into his eyes and promised to love, honour, and cherish him, meaning every word with her whole heart. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the vicar intoned, and Sebastian kissed her to the applause of the congregation. Eleanor, now the Duchess of Ashford, felt a moment of surreal disbelief before joy overwhelmed everything else. The reception was elegant and surprisingly warm. Many of the guests were Sebastian's political allies and Lady Agatha's intellectual circle, people who valued substance over superficial propriety. There were some notable absences. Lady Victoria had declined the invitation, as had several of the more conservative society families, but their absence was more than compensated for by the genuine warmth of those who attended. During the dancing, Eleanor found herself partnered with various guests, all of whom offered congratulations and, in some cases, genuine friendship. The Duchess of Pemberton told her, "You've done well, my dear. Ashford is a good man, and you'll be good for him. Don't let the old guard intimidate you." As the evening drew to a close, Sebastian and Eleanor slipped away to the private sitting room where, months ago, Dr. Morrison had treated her injured ankle. "Do you remember this room?" Sebastian asked, pulling her close. "How could I forget? This is where everything changed." "No," Sebastian said softly. "Everything changed the moment you asked if you could rest. That's when I knew I couldn't keep pretending that society's rules mattered more than human decency. That's when I started to fall in love with you." Eleanor smiled up at him. "I was so frightened that night. I thought my life was over." "It was," Sebastian said. "Your old life ended, and a new one began. Our life together." They left London the next day for a honeymoon in the Lake District, far from society's prying eyes. For 2 weeks, they walked along mountain paths, read poetry by the fire, and talked about their hopes for the future. Sebastian shared his plans for parliamentary reform, his desire to use his wealth and position to make meaningful change. Eleanor spoke of her wish to support his work, to perhaps start a school for girls from poor families, to use her new position to help others who had been in her situation. "We'll do it together," Sebastian promised. "Everything we do from now on, we'll do together." When they returned to London, it was to move into Ashford House, the ducal residence that would be their primary home. Eleanor walked through the grand rooms with a mixture of awe and determination. This was her home now, her responsibility. She would learn to manage it, to be the duchess these halls required, but she would do it on her own terms. Her first act as the Duchess of Ashford was to call a meeting with all the household staff. Standing in the servants' hall where she had once eaten her meals, she addressed the assembled maids, footmen, and other workers. "I know my elevation to this position is unusual," she said clearly. "I know some of you remember me as a housemaid. I want you to know that I haven't forgotten what that life was like. I will treat you with respect and fairness, and I expect the same in return. If you have concerns or problems, you may bring them to me. No one in this household should ever feel they can't report an injury or ask for help." She saw understanding and relief in many faces, and knew she had made the right choice. Mrs. Blackwood, who had been retained despite Eleanor's private reservations, looked uncomfortable, but nodded respectfully. The months that followed were challenging but rewarding. Eleanor learned to navigate her new role, making mistakes but learning from them. She hosted dinners for Sebastian's political allies, using the skills Lady Agatha had taught her to create an atmosphere where meaningful conversation flourished. She began planning her school for girls, working with reformers and educators to create something truly innovative. And through it all, Sebastian was beside her, supporting her, loving her, reminding her on difficult days why they had chosen this path. One afternoon, 6 months after their wedding, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor. Lady Victoria was announced, and Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse to see her. But curiosity won out, and she agreed to receive her former rival. Lady Victoria looked thinner, harder, her beauty dimmed by bitterness. "I suppose you're wondering why I've come," she said without preamble. "I am rather curious," Eleanor admitted, keeping her voice neutral. "I came to tell you that you were right and I was wrong." Lady Victoria's voice was flat. "I married Lord Hartwick 3 months ago. He's wealthy, titled, everything I thought I wanted. He's also cruel, controlling, and unfaithful. I'm miserable, and I have no one to blame but myself." Eleanor felt a surge of pity. "I'm sorry to hear that, Lady Victoria." "Are you? I wouldn't be in your place. I was vile to you." Lady Victoria met her eyes. "I didn't come here for your pity or your forgiveness. I came because I needed to see for myself if it was real, if you and Ashford are truly happy, or if it's all a performance for society." "It's real," Eleanor said softly. "We're very happy." Lady Victoria nodded slowly. "I can see that. It's in your eyes, in the way you speak of him. You have what I thought I was too good for. Genuine love. I hope you appreciate it. I do, Eleanor said. Every day. Your D. After Lady Victoria left, Eleanor stood at the window of her drawing room, looking out at the London street below. She thought of the girl she had been, the housemaid with a twisted ankle and no prospects, and she thought of the woman she had become, a duchess, yes, but more importantly, a woman who had found her voice, her purpose, and her place in the world. The journey hadn't been easy, and she knew challenges still lay ahead. But she also knew that she had Sebastian beside her, Lady Agatha's wisdom to guide her, and her own strength to sustain her. She had asked if she could rest, and in answering, Sebastian had given her not just a moment's respite, but a lifetime of partnership. It was more than she had ever dreamed possible, and she would spend the rest of her life proving herself worthy of it. 2 years after her wedding, Eleanor stood in the assembly hall of the Hartley School for Girls, watching as 50 students from London's poorest neighbourhoods practiced their reading. The school, funded by the Ashford fortune, and Eleanor's tireless advocacy, had become her greatest pride. Here, girls who would otherwise have had no education learned reading, writing, mathematics, and practical skills that would allow them to support themselves with dignity. "They're doing wonderfully," Sebastian said, coming to stand beside her. He had just returned from Parliament where he'd successfully championed a bill improving working conditions in factories. His political career had flourished, his willingness to break with his class on matters of reform, earning him both enemies and devoted allies. "They are," Eleanor agreed, her heart full. "Last week, one of our first students secured a position as a governess. A real position with fair wages and respect. That's what we're building here. Opportunities." Sebastian took her hand. "You're building it. This was your vision." "Our vision," Eleanor corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without your support." It was true. In the 2 years since their marriage, they had become true partners. Sebastian consulted Eleanor on his political work, valuing her insights and her understanding of the struggles facing ordinary people. Eleanor relied on Sebastian's connections and resources to make her educational reforms a reality. Together, they had become a formidable team, respected even by those who had initially scorned their union. Society had largely accepted Eleanor, though there were still drawing rooms where she was not welcome and matrons who sniffed disapprovingly when she passed. But she had found her own circle, reformers, intellectuals, and progressive aristocrats who valued her mind and her character. The Duchess of Pemberton had become a genuine friend, as had several other influential women who supported Eleanor's educational work. Lady Agatha, now in her late 60s, remained Eleanor's closest confidant and fiercest champion. She divided her time between Bath and London, her salon having become one of the most sought-after intellectual gatherings in England. "You've exceeded every expectation," she told Eleanor one afternoon over tea. "You've not only adapted to your position, you've transformed it. You're using your influence for genuine good. That's rare, my dear, and precious." Even the Dowager Duchess had softened, particularly after Eleanor had given birth to a son, the future Duke of Ashford, 6 months prior. Catherine had been surprisingly tender with her grandson, and her relationship with Eleanor had evolved into something approaching genuine affection. "You've made my son happy," she told Eleanor one day while they watched Sebastian play with baby James. "And you're raising my grandson with both privilege and compassion. That's all I can ask." Eleanor's relationship with the household staff had also evolved. She had replaced Mrs. Blackwood with a kinder, more progressive housekeeper and had implemented policies ensuring fair treatment and reasonable working conditions. The servants respected her, and many were genuinely loyal, remembering that their Duchess had once stood where they stood. One spring morning, Eleanor received a letter that brought tears to her eyes. It was from Sarah, the young scullery maid who had spilled tea on the carpet years ago, the girl Eleanor had helped and comforted. Sarah wrote that she had left service to attend the Hartley School and was now training to be a teacher herself. "You showed me kindness when I was nobody," Sarah wrote. "Now I want to show that same kindness to others. Thank you for believing that people like us matter." Eleanor showed the letter to Sebastian that evening as they sat in their private sitting room, baby James sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby. "This is why we do it," she said softly. "One girl at a time, one life changed, one opportunity given. It matters." "You matter," Sebastian said, pulling her close. "Do you know that? Do you know how extraordinary you are?" Eleanor smiled against his shoulder. "I know that I'm happy. I know that I'm loved, and I know that I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." She thought back to that night 2 years ago, when she had been a frightened housemaid, asking if she could rest. She had been seeking only a moment's relief from pain, but she had found so much more: love, purpose, partnership, and a future beyond anything she had imagined. The journey from housemaid to duchess had been improbable, challenging, and occasionally painful, but it had also been transformative, teaching her that worth was not determined by birth but by character, that love could transcend social barriers, and that one person's compassion could change the course of a life. As for Lady Victoria, Eleanor heard occasional reports through the social grapevine. She had separated from Lord Hartwick after a particularly public scandal, and now lived quietly in the country, her beauty faded and her prospects dim. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in her former rival's misfortune, only a quiet sadness for a woman who had valued the wrong things and paid a heavy price. The Hartley School continued to grow, expanding to include vocational training and eventually opening a second location. Eleanor's work attracted attention from other reformers, and she found herself invited to speak at gatherings and contribute to publications about education and women's rights. She was no longer just the Duchess of Ashford. She was Eleanor Thornbury, educator and advocate, a woman with her own identity and purpose. Sebastian's political career also flourished. His willingness to champion unpopular causes earned him respect across party lines, and he became known as a voice for progressive reform. He and Eleanor often worked late into the night, discussing strategy and drafting proposals, their partnership extending into every aspect of their lives. On their third wedding anniversary, Sebastian took Eleanor back to Ashford Manor for a private celebration. They stood in the ballroom where their story had begun, now empty and quiet, the chandeliers dark. "Do you ever regret it?" Sebastian asked softly. "The scandal, the struggle, the battles we've fought?" Eleanor looked around the ballroom, remembering that night, the pain, the fear, the moment when everything changed. Then she looked at her husband, the man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had risked everything to help her, who had given her not just his name, but his heart and his partnership. "Never," she said firmly, "not for a single moment. This life with you fighting for things that matter, it's more than I ever dreamed possible. You asked me once if I could rest, and I've been resting in your love ever since. Not resting as in stopping, but resting as in being home, being where I belong." Sebastian kissed her then, tender and deep, and Eleanor felt the truth of her words settle into her bones. She had asked if she could rest, and he had carried her not just across a ballroom, but into a life of meaning, purpose, and love. The housemaid who had been nobody was now somebody, not because of her title, but because she had found her voice, her strength, and her place in the world. And the Duke, who had carried her, had found something equally precious. A partner who saw him not as a title, but as a man, who loved him not for his position, but for his heart. Together they had proven that love could transcend class, that compassion could change lives, and that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the simplest question: can I rest here? The answer, Eleanor knew now, was yes. Yes, you can rest. Yes, you can be seen. Yes, you can be loved. Yes, you can bloom exactly where you're planted and create a garden of hope for others to follow. And that, she thought as Sebastian took her hand and led her from the ballroom, was the greatest gift of all. If you've been listening to this story, I hope it touched your heart. Please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. Your support means everything, and I love knowing how far these stories travel. Thank you for being here.